Welcome to the fitting bay, everybody. My name is Nathan. Thank you for watching. So today we're going to be looking at a Nissan Patrol and how to hardwire a aftermarket radio into it. So let's get stuck right into it. First things first, we have two Phillips head screws holding this fascia panel in. We'll remove those screws and it's literally just clips after that. Once we pop that out, we can see that there is two plugs on the right hand side. We'll remove those plugs and put the fascia down. Now, 4 screws holding in the factory radio. We'll unplug the factory radio, put it up on the bench. We will use the brackets of that radio for our new radio. Okay, now we'll look at the wiring here. So there was a couple of other plugs plugged into this wiring, as you can see. We've just unplugged them. That were just adapters for the factory radio. Now we're not going to chop the plugs off this. Chopping the plugs off is a bad idea. If you're doing your own car or someone else's car and they decide they want to put the factory radio back in, you're in trouble. So keep that in mind. Now I'm using a 12 volt test light here. It's important that it's 12 volt or has a halogen globe in it for when we test the power antenna. The second plug there is 2 twisted pairs, which I can tell you now are just speakers. There's 4 twisted pairs in total for 4 speakers. That's not always the assumption you should make, but in this case they are speaker wires. So we see one wire here lights up, the test light, when we put it on. Right, now the other end of the test light is just grounded to the car, so there's part of the chassis is behind the dash there. We've just clamped onto that. So the wire that was getting power gets power directly from the battery, and the next wire we're going to test for now is the ignition or switched wire. So now this wire will get power only when the ignition is on. So there's 2 wires in total, constant and ignition. The ignition power will basically tell the radio to turn on, and the constant wire will remember your radio stations and settings and all that sort of stuff. So apart from that, your main power wires, you've got constant, accessories or ignition, ground, and power antenna in this car. Now I'm using side cutters here to show you that you can use side cutters to strip these wires if you don't have wire strippers. It does take a bit longer. Okay, so if you need to, just take a screenshot of what's coming up next. It's a universal speaker wiring diagram. You can Google this if you want. All your aftermarket radios, this is what they're going to go by. Okay, so I will explain this in a minute as well, but there's a picture there too. Okay, so we've got front left, front right, which is grey, rear left, green, and rear right, purple. Steering wheel control remote we're not going to use. Power antenna, this is power continuation, so you can use this for an antenna or an amplifier. Today we're just going to be using it for the power antenna. And the 3 wires there, which is red, ignition, constant, and ground. There's another mute wire there, which we're not going to use. Don't need it. I mean, these units all have Bluetooth built in, so they mute themselves automatically. So we're going to put our constant wire to the wire that we tested with constant power, ignition to ignition, ground. Now there's no ground wire in this loom, so we're going to have to actually extend that ground wire and drill into the body of the car, and behind the dash there's there's a good ground source there where we put our test light. We'll ground to that. Now using the 12 volt test light, we're going to put the clamp on the constant power wire, and we're going to probe the other wires, and we're going to watch for that antenna at the left, and we'll see when we hit the antenna, the power antenna wire, the antenna will come up like that. It's important that you use a test light for this, because you do not want to put constant power onto random wires. You'll get a short circuit, you'll pop a fuse. So use a test light. If you get the wrong wire, the test light will light up. You know, if you get a grounded wire, some illumination and negative triggered. So we strip that, we put our power wire onto the antenna wire. There's another wire in there for illumination, which this harness doesn't have an illumination wire. But to test that, same thing, test light on ground, probe, and turn the lights on. You'll see one light up. Okay, now we're going to solder all these connections. Make sure you solder these connections. Go to your auto parts store or online, get a good soldering iron, and make sure you solder this stuff up. Okay, after we've soldered and taped our power wires, we can test our speaker wires. So what I've just picked up here is just a AA battery with a wire on either end. So we have that wire going to one end, or the positive side of the battery, doesn't matter what's what, and this one going to the other end. We've taped it up, taped the wires to each end, and tape that up nicely. So with our twisted pairs, what we're going to do is put one piece of copper on one side and one on the opposite side, and it's going to pop the corresponding speaker. You'll hear the speaker itself pop. So that's going to tell us what speaker is where. Now I'm going to do how to check polarity in a different video, but in this car it's actually all the black wires that are negative, but the pins are opposed to each other. So if in this case the plug had 4 speakers in a row, you could make all the top side of the plug negative and all of the bottom positive, and that would be the same. So they don't, you know, the manufacturers don't change the wiring up in that sense. So in this case, we've got the front 2 speakers on the big plug and the rear 2 on the small plug. We can make the top wires negative. That's actually what they are in this car. So both top wires, we will put our grey with black stripe for the right side, white with white stripe for the left side, and in rear, green with black stripe and purple with black stripe at the top of the plug. So if you get the polarity wrong, it's not going to blow up anything. The speakers aren't going to pop, but they're going to be out of phase. Especially if you're changing the speakers over, or if you're looking to enhance your sound system, you don't want them to be out of phase. So you need to make sure what you do it across the board. Okay, so if you wire the polarity up backwards, you need to do it to every speaker. Okay, now our speakers are done. We'll fire up our soldering iron. And we're going to look at running the Bluetooth microphone. Now, I'm going to mount this in the roof lining and run it down the A-pillar. Very important, remove the A-pillar. Some cars like this, there's going to be some screws with the handle. Some cars will have an airbag, little flap that you have to pop open, and there'll be a hidden screw behind there. Look for a hidden screw or a couple of hidden screws in there, otherwise it's just going to be clips. This car, not such a big deal, but tucking the microphone wire behind this rubber here is a terrible idea, especially with cars that have curtain airbags and airbags that run down the A-pillar. So we pop that off. We can see there's already some wiring actually run down. So all we're going to do is mount the microphone in the roof lining. We're going to tape up our loom. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually putting a fair bit of tape around the mounting bracket itself. So if you put that bracket on the roof lining, it's very, very loose. So we'll put a bit of tape around that, a fair bit of tape around that, and get it nice and tight, so that when you actually mount this on the roof lining, it doesn't go anywhere. Once we have all of our connections soldered and taped, we can finish taping up this loom. Now, as you can see, the ground wire is still yet to be done, but apart from that, we can finish this off and get it looking nice. So we've just put a ring terminal or an eye terminal on the ground wire. We're just drilling that into a nice unpainted part of the chassis there, which you can actually see with the light. We'll solder up the connection that we did, so we had to extend that ground wire in the end. So once we've run our microphone through the roof lining and taped it up to the loom that's already there, we're going to actually run it behind the glove box. Now, this glove box won't actually come out, but you can get it to come forward just a little bit further than the clips that are holding it in, so they just pop out ever so lightly. Now, I'm just fitting my hand up behind the glove box to sort of meet the wiring there, and as you can see, we've shaken it up a little bit. And so we're going to pull the wiring through to behind the glove box. Now, rather than just going directly across, we're actually going to go behind the dash. Now, you can just feed your hand up through there. I'm just going to finish taping up this loom. And so we can feed the wire up and then meet it at the other end. And then into behind the radio. And so if we look in there, we don't see the wire, but it's actually behind that panel. Some cars, you can do that. You can actually, get your hand in there and get behind it. Some vehicles you will not be able to do that. You might have to go under the glove box or pull the glove box out. It just depends on the vehicle. So we're going to pop our A pillar back on. There's a clip that's left over, so make sure you check, look for any clips that got left behind, pop them back in place. And then we can get our A pillar back on. Perfect. And fix up that rubber. Just a quick note here, guys, you can see I'm using a screwdriver first just to start that thread before we nip it up with the drill. So last thing you want to do is cross thread some of these screws. Okay, so now we're going to remove the brackets from the factory radio and put them on to the aftermarket radio. This unit, or this car, doesn't need another fascia panel or ring or trim ring or anything like that. It's going to be very straightforward. So what I'm doing here is lining up the units just to see roughly where we're going to mount our screw holes, but as you can see, this one actually has locating tabs, so they're going to fall into place. We'll repeat this for the other side. Okay, we're going to put the old radio in the box and give that back to the customer. Along with those spare plugs, or those plugs that were actually attached to the loom. Okay, we're going to look at all of our plugs here. Power wire, or power harness, power and speaker harness, microphone, antenna. These are the 3 plugs that we're using. So you can see there's 3 pre-outs here on this unit. So in the future we're going to look at amplifiers and all that sort of stuff. So we get our unit in place. We've got 4 screws holding it in. So we'll nip them up, get our fascia panel back on. Don't forget to plug in the 2 plugs that you unplugged, along with the 2 screws that hold the fascia in place. Now, right about now, start testing. So, just before you go all the way back together, make sure it boots up, test your radio stations, set your time and date, all that sort of stuff. And that's it, all done, in, working, set up. Okay, unit looks good, we're happy with how it looks. Behind the unit looks good, connections have been soldered, taped up, the looms have been taped up nicely, microphone's been run properly. I'm doing one last check. Perfect. And that's what you want.